Dire wave
3.
Dire wave
3.
Dire wave.
3.
Science comes out of medieval universities. This may be totally lost on modern people, but no, actually modern science comes out of universities. Guess where universities come from? Byzantium. What is the theology of Byzantium? Orthodoxy. The longest running empire, the most successful economic empire in the history of the world was Orthodox. It was Byzantium. So we give universities, we give civilization, all of these things come from the treasures of Orthodoxy. So I would say that we can prove that our morals, our theology is from God. I'm not saying that just because of history it proves it. I was just rebutting certain points that he made about history. We've actually built civilizations. Canon law is very important in the history of law. History of law theory, universities come from Orthodoxy. So when we reject dialectics and dialectical tensions and the presuppositions of dialectics, which are the very root of all Gnostic systems, are all built on dialectical tensions and the assumptions of dialectics, all the way back to Plato. When we reject that, what we're left with is a unique revealed anthropology and a unique metaphysic, a unique worldview, a unique ethic that is not just in theory. It's actually been proved and stamped into history in the longest empire in the world.
All right, welcome. Can you guys hear me? Hello? Do we have any sound? Yo. I think you guys can hear me. I know you can't. I know. Hello?
Oh, hello.
Okay, yeah. There was a pop-up for join with audio that I didn't.
Okay. Should we have cams on, or is it just going to be your face on the stream?
You can do whatever you want. You're on the stream in the box in the
All
corner.
Right.
Dave, we like to see your face.
Yeah. What's up?
Check it out, dude.
I woke up an hour ago, so I
Well,
got the gamer face.
we appreciate you waking up to do this.
Of course.
Man,
It's
you
just that I
as
just woke up
stylish
like
a
2 hours
head-
early.
headphones as me.
Kind of, yeah.
Hey, Melissa, can I trade your headphones for these? I don't like these ones. actually.
It makes
Welcome.
you look like a construction worker.
We're all live, by the way.
Hello.
So.
Oh, nice.
We're like, hold on a second, I'm gonna put on new headsets. That helps me do theology and philosophy better.
Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're going to cover Origenism. We're not going to be covering just the controversial doctrine of apocalyptic. That's usually what people think of when they hear the term Origenism. They think, oh, this equals Universalism. That's only one of the areas of his theology that we're going to cover, discuss, and explain why it's problematic. And not just problematic, but condemned at least 3 times over in ecumenical councils. So I've got my Origen works right here next to me, and I've got my all my secondary scholarship too. So David, I would like to bring in eventually your video that you did too, because you kind of hit on one of the key points that people like David Bentley Hart misunderstand or don't know what they're talking about when we talk about nature and person and the mode of nature and that kind of stuff, created hypostasis. But how do you guys want to start it? What do you think is the best route to go here?
I think the best route to start is basically, I think it will be through the ecumenical councils, kind of just hammering the point home that he has been condemned, and that should kind of be, that alone should be the end of the debate for a lot of Orthodox and generally anyone that's accepting the ecumenical council. So the anti-Origenist argument goes something like, he was condemned in the 5th ecumenical council. Right? He was one of the people anathematized. And then the counter argument to that is that that's a later addition. They give some reasons. One of the reasons is that there was an Origenist in the council. This is a very bad argument. It's a bad argument because you had Nestorius being condemned in front of Nestorians or Nestorianizers. In Chalcedon, for example, you had people that were very quick to abandon him. But there is still, you can still say in some way, some Nestorianizers in Chalcedon that still went on with an anathematization. So that's a bad argument on its face. That will be my first response. And then you have generally, it's a historical case that is very difficult to make in general. Another big problem is that you're basically saying that any ecumenical council, right? This is an ecumenical council that we had for 14 centuries. And if we had the wrong version for 14 centuries, then that begs the question, how do we know any of our ecumenical councils? If this aspect...
That's the point I was just going to make too. Is these
I'm sorry
councils are received, and if we got to throw that out, then everything's out.
Exactly. If that can be thrown out, everything can be thrown out. Everything. So aside from being a difficult historical case to make, it's just goes against how we understand ecumenical councils. The other main problem is that this is not just the 5th council. The 6th and the 7th councils, when they start with summarizing the previous councils, they kind of include what happened in the previous councils. And both the 6th and the 7th, when they summarize the 5th council, they say Origen was anathematized in this council, right? So we anathematize Origen, we anathematize Theodore of Mopsuestia, another person that was anathema in that council. And so it's not just the 5th council, right? The argument is not just the 5th, it's the 6th and the 7th too. If the 5th was a later addition, well, the 6th and the 7th disagree on that, right? Another argument I want to make in general from the historical perspective of the lives of the saints, we look at Saint Photius's Bibliotheca, and when he reviews, because Bibliotheca is literally just a book review of several different works, several different books. One of the books he reviews is the Acts of the 5th Council. And he says Origen was condemned here, right? So Saint Photius, who is a very erudite scholar, he's not just some guy. He's a very erudite scholar. He knows about this kind of stuff.
Well, he's also one of the pillars of Orthodoxy.
Exactly. So if there was an addition, he will be the first person to know in Orthodox history. But he himself understands Origen is a heretic. He says Origen is a heretic when he reviews but he reviews one of Origen's works, and he basically says this is blasphemous, right? Look at Origen's blasphemies in this work he produced. He calls Origen a heretic. You look at I believe this is from the Spiritual Meters of Saint Basil the New. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember talking about this in a video on Archbishop Alexander Golitsyn. I make this point where we have in the Lives of the Saints, one of the saints, again, this is Saint Basil the New, I believe. I might be wrong. You can check out that video on Archbishop Alexander for more details. You have in some Lives of the Saints people saying Origen is straight up in hell. So he's not just condemned. These people, like in the Lives of our Saints, he's not just some condemned, he was wrong. No. These people even say he was in hell, right? And just that entire patristic witness in Orthodoxy testifies that Origen is a condemned heretic, just historically speaking. Of course, there's a theology side to it that we'll get into. Why was he even condemned in the Fifth Council? What happened? We can all explain that in the stream, but I think the best place to start is just generally kind of explaining the history related to Origen. And I just want to kind of consider this argument that people are going to use. But there were some saints that quoted and cited Origen. And I think this is an argument of its own. That's not an argument. The saints have quoted a lot of different people. They have cited a lot of different people to prove their point. Just because they do it with Origen does not suddenly mean that Origen is one of them. We have saints that quote Aristotle when they're trying to make their point. That doesn't mean Aristotle is a church father, right? So that's also a bad argument. You'll notice this.
Wait,
in
hold on a
people's
second.
defense
What
of
did
Origen.
you just say?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. Roman Catholics will have a problem with saying Aristotle's not a church father.
By the way, David, let's just play devil's advocate. What would you say if somebody says, well, he was condemned posthumously? That's not fair. He didn't have a chance to kind of defend himself. I'm sure you've heard this objection before.
Yeah.
You can take this one if you want.
Snek can
Yes,
take it.
Snek,
He's
go.
more.
Yeah, go, Snek.
So, but before everything, we should maybe start by just giving a rough introduction of who Origen was, because some people might not be aware. So, Origen was a very influential early Christian writer. He's actually the son of a martyr, and he was from Alexandria, and he produced some very popular works against the pagans, for example, Contra Celsus, and he was controversial during his lifetime as well. And a bit later we're going to cover, the pre-Fifth Council's arguments of the saints against Origen. But one of the arguments that is brought up is that Origen died. Origen is a very early figure, and the Fifth Council is centuries away from Origen. And some people brought up the argument that, you cannot condemn someone posthumously. You cannot condemn someone after their death. Well, these people should simply read the council. The council brings up the fact that we can see historically heretics being condemned after their death. Actually, they bring up Augustine quite a bit by saying that St. Augustine and the Church of Africa actually had a habit of condemning people after their death for their writings. They also bring up the fact that the Robust Council of Ephesus II, which condemned Saint Flavian, was overturned. So they make a case negatively as well. They say, Chalcedon actually managed to exculpate Saint Flavian. So the opposite would be possible. And there are also other examples, in church history, Macedonius, Apollinarius, and so on, were controversial during their lives, but only condemned after their death. And again, we should also think, shouldn't we be able to condemn people after their death? Does that mean that you can literally write heresy, propagate it, as long as you don't get caught before you're on your deathbed? That's a bit too easy, right?
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And actually, another argument that is brought up is the idea that Origen's works are condemned, but not Origen himself. That's a very common argument, and to that I would simply answer with the Sixth Council, because the Sixth Council actually makes a distinction between condemning someone and condemning someone's works. Only they don't do it for Origen. They do it for, I think, Theodore of Mopsuestia. But
No. They don't do it for Theodore. They do it for Theodoret of Cyrus.
Theodore of Cyrus.
He's not condemned as a person, but his writings, anti-Cyrillian writings, are condemned. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, like these distinctions exist, but you do not see it in the Sixth Council for Origen. You do not see it in the Fifth Council for Origen. You do not see it in the Seventh Council. You do not see it in any of the condemnations that we sing, any of the anathema. You don't see it in the later writers. Saint John of Damascus condemns these ideas of Origen.
Now, doesn't the Sixth and Seventh Ecumenical Council also confirm the previous councils too?
Always.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. If you have a problem with it, you have to throw.
Yeah, if you
all
have
the
if
rest
you have a problem, that's kind of like the point that I was going for. Is if you make this argument, you're not just throwing the Fifth Council out. You're throwing the Sixth and the Seventh out. You're basically saying these councils are not legitimate either, and we can just change them, right, retroactively.
Yeah, it's also too one of the sophistry arguments that comes up around this. They'll say, well, they had a wrong doctrine of Origenism. They were condemning something that wasn't really Origen's doctrine. But really, this also undercuts the idea that somehow we have better access than the saints had at that time, and it still means that the ecumenical councils were all wrong, because so you have three successive councils that basically didn't know what Origenism was, made a huge gigantic blunder because it plays very heavily, for example, into the condemnation in the Confession of Saint Sophronius, which is accepted at the Sixth Council. So you've got a lot of serious problems for the notion of dogma. But by the way, a lot of the liberal academics that are pushing Origenism don't believe in dogma anyway, so they don't care. They're quite happy to say, yeah, there's no dogma, council's error, so what?
Yeah, maybe we should cover the early history of Origen and how he was received, because, yeah, as David said, one of the big arguments is to say that many of our saints appreciated Origen, actually sampled some parts of Origen works. The Cappadocians, for example, were big on Origenism. Not Origenism, but Origen himself. They would actually, I think Saint Basil wrote a Philokalia of Origen. And that's an argument like, oh, he inspired someone. Well, Origen inspired many people,
Right,
with many different results. Origen is one of the best preserved early writers. He was very influential. He was from Alexandria at the time where Alexandria was shining the brightest. And I would like to just use the words of Gennadios of Constantinople. When he looks back during the Council of Florence, he says, the Westerners writers say, where Origen was good, no one was better, whereas where he was bad, no one is worse. Or Asian divines, so the Easterners, says that on the one hand, Origen is a whetstone of her soul, but on the other hand, he is the fount of false doctrines. Both are right. He is splendidly defended Christianity, wonderfully expanded scripture, and wrote a noble exhortation to martyrdom, but he was also the father of Arianism, and worst of all said that hellfire would not last forever. So you can see that he was an apologist. He had important writings, inspired many great people, but also some others, like Arianism, has been linked to some doctrines of Origen, which clearly teaches subordinationism in some of his writings. That doesn't mean that the saints that were inspired by him took that specifically in their doctrine. Actually, Saint Basil is very famous for saying that we should be like bees. We should take what is good in all these writers. So that's not an argument, and we can see that there are counterexamples in early church history. Origen was controversial during his lifetime, and there was early crises about Origenism. Most notably, the first Origenist crisis, where the person who took the lead against the Origenists was a bishop of Alexandria who was very violent and violently persecuted them, and that's why some Origenists were protected and sheltered because of this violence. But that doesn't take back the fact that you had condemnations of his doctrines that were accepted widely in Alexandria, that were accepted in Rome even, you know. I think the Pope of the time actually accepted condemnations against Origen. And this crisis left a sour taste in the mouth of the East, because, especially Constantinople, because it ended up with the Synod of the Oak, the position of Saint John Chrysostom. But that still shows that there was a problem with Origenism at the time, from the place where Origen lived, you know, in Alexandria. If you look a bit later, I mean, during this crisis, you have saints actually accusing Origen. You have, I think, Epiphanes of Salamis. You have many saints leading the charge the other way. And it was pretty much understood at the time, especially in Alexandria. And remember, Orthodoxy is universal. And Alexandria is really one of the big centers of Orthodoxy. So we also need to take their take into account. If you look at the testimonies that are brought up against Dioscorus by the Alexandrian people during the Council of Chalcedon, they also, whenever they want to pinpoint they want to say that someone is a heretic but cannot really pinpoint a heresy, they will say, is an Origenist. You had people, I think the nephew of Saint Cyril, saying Dioscorus embraced the heresy of Origen. So he already was infamous at the time. And even some saints that were inspired by him, we can see that in their surroundings, the Origenists were causing problems. I was reading the life of St. Paula the other day, and St. Paula was a disciple of Jerome, St. Jerome, who himself was a disciple of Didymus, who himself was a disciple of Origen. And St. Paula was a very learned woman, and she still complains about the Origenists causing problems and spreading heresy.
Yeah, and by the way, there's another argument that's made. Oh, he was never condemned in his day. That's not true. Saint, I think it's Optatus, one of the saints in his day. I was just looking at it the other day. I posted it in the Discord, and I've already forgot who it was, but it's either Optinus or Optatus, one of the saints that was contemporary right after his death, had looked at his writings and realized that it was heretical, that it did have a lot of heretical ideas in it. But it's important to note that it really takes a long time for his works to circulate and for people to really kind of see what was going on. So it's not like you can just do this move of, well, why didn't everybody just, off the bat condemn him right away? Well, this is the ancient world. It takes time for text to circulate. It takes time for councils to look at these works and to deal with the controversies. So I think we have to keep that in mind, because you'll hear this objection all the time, like, why wasn't he condemned in his day? Well, actually he was.
He was, and he was condemned a bit later during the first Origen's crisis, and the second one during the Fifth Council, and then we can attest it. There's a line of people condemning him. And again, we should really look at what Alexandria says, because it's the home turf. If you're hated, and if people quote you as the generic heretic, whenever they want to say that someone is a heretic, if they associate you with him, it's probably a problem. And that was also one of the concerns of Saint Justinian during the Fifth Council, was to reunite the theology that is universal. We do not have just a Western
who did you say
theology.
Was the contemporary? I'm trying to remember.
I'm trying to find it. I can't remember.
Saint Optatus, or
That's it. I think it's yeah.
Um,
It's a lesser known saint, but he condemned Origen right after Origen had passed away.
Yeah.
I think I
And
tweeted
on
it.
the-
I'm trying to find it.
And on the topic of Saint Justinian, because this is going to be a relevant book now, the unfortunate thing about this book is that this is a pretty rare book. It cost me a lot to buy this, and I think there's only one left in Amazon. This is called Defense of
don't
Culture
show
in the East.
people. Don't show people that. You'll have somebody breaking into your house to
Oh, yeah.
steal it.
to steal valuable treasures. But this book, Defense of Chalcedon in the East by Patrick Gray, covers the distinct Christologies at that time of the Fifth Council, right? Before the time of the Fifth Council. Now, there are different Christological positions in the church. You had basically people that rejected Chalcedon, the Monophysites. You had Nestorianizers. You had Orthodox Cyrillic Chalcedonians. And the fourth party, which a lot of people miss, but this book doesn't, is the Origenist party, represented by people like, now this is debatable whether he's an Origenist, but Leontius of Byzantium and people like that. I think he is, because Leontius of Jerusalem, his contemporary, basically calls him one. But Origenistic Christology was also a factor in that time. And as a system, it looked very similar to Nestorianism because it spoke of two hypostases in Christ. But it's also a mixture of Eutychianism in a sense, where the two hypostases, the two natures, basically come together and form this new hypostasis, this new tertium quid, that's the indefinable third thing. And a lot of Origenists basically had that kind of a Christology. And so when you had people running amok like this, when you had people kind of subverting Chalcedon like this and understanding it in this way, it seems very, very plausible that St. Justine will look at it and say, well, if we're going to be handling the Monophysites and the Nestorians, we have to be handling these guys too, right? So it's not just something that, like a lot of people think, he just didn't like Origen and he just wants to get rid of him. It wasn't something random like that. It was something that affected that specific time. And again, a lot of Origenists themselves had a very wrong Christology that needed to be refuted.
Yeah, I've got the quote right here, one of the quotes. By the way, it's St. Methodius. I found it. It says, St. Methodius had a comprehensive philosophical education. He was an important theologian and prolific author. His works can only be assigned chronologically to the end of the 3rd century. He became of special importance in the history of theological literature in that he combated the various erroneous views of Origen. Particularly, he attacked Origen's doctrine that man's body at the resurrection would not be the same body that he had in this life. Also, he found the idea of the world's eternality as an erroneous notion. Now, that's going to come up later when we look at the eternal fall and eternal world. Genesis, kinesis, stasis is what we're going to be looking at here. But that's St. Methodius, is who was right after Origen and did condemn his errors at the time. I would add that if you have the Schaff set, you do have older, translations of multiple works of Origen. And one example would be in the commentary on John in chapter 6, Origen's commentary on John. Let me see which book. Book 2, chapter 6. Origen states that we do believe that there is a second beside the Father. He, being the same as the Father, while manifestly distinct, is drawn between the Spirit and the Son in this passage. And he's talking about the maker of all things were made through him, through Christ. So this is the sense in which Origen understands that made through Christ. He says, whenever we speak, whoever shall speak a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. Whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. We consider, therefore, that there are three hypostases, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And at the same time, we believe that nothing is uncreated except the Father. So there's going to be a lot of debate and confusion about in what sense Origen speaks of Christ as subordinate, but also as God, which would seem to suggest basically a Hellenic chain of being type of philosophy, where there are created gods or gods that have a beginning in time. And Origen will go into, of course, great depths to utilize Hellenic philosophy, the presuppositions of Hellenism to try to explain that, while at the same time holding to the Plotinian definition of simplicity, that distinction always entails composition or division. And we'll see that here in a moment with the citations and first principles from Origen. But I would also just mention in passing, one of the reasons why Origen was so important was that he had all of these biblical commentaries. So he was an early exegete. He did the hexapla. He was important in textual criticism at that time. He was one of the first textual critics. But for example, in his commentary on Matthew, if you look at his comments on Peter's not the rock. The keys are possessed by all the episcopate. If you look over at his discussion of clergy, he mentions married clergy. If you look at his discussion of the divorce of Israel. That's the whole chapter that he wrote in his commentary on Matthew. If you have the shaft set, this is on page 507. And so he teaches preterism, right? So he teaches many, many correct things, and he was in many ways insightful. And I think that that's the draw, right, that was so powerful at the time, was that he had a grasp of the languages of philosophy, and did a kind of apologetics against, the pagans and the Hellenists. So that's why he was so influential. But again, that's not enough to be orthodox, right? It's not enough just to have some good arguments, to have a lot of books, to have a lot of academic knowledge, if you depart in any of the crucial key doctrines. And of course, we know that the resurrection of the body, creation of the world ex nihilo, the homoousios doctrine, the doctrine that Christ is of the same essence as the Father, he's of the Father's essence. Then, if we're departing from those things, then we're departing from, the basic understanding of things in the creed.
And Jay, notice that Origen's double procession is really the same problem that comes up with the Filioque over and over again, and for the same reasons, I'd argue.
Yeah, Rada Galwitz has a good section on Origen. And so I made several notes on Origen. Has a unique doctrine of simplicity that's, you have to understand Clement of Alexandria's doctrine of divine simplicity, where there's a kind of, according to what Losky was saying, there's this identification of the Father with what is apophatic, right? The Father is unknowable. The Father is the beyond being essence. And then the Son in Clement's theology kind of works as the bridge by which we have, it's almost like he sees the Son like the icon of an unknowable essence, right? So there's not Trinitarianism, as Losky notes in Clement. There is a kind of Platonism, or a modification of Platonism, that's not Trinitarian. It's more like gradations of being. So what we think of in terms of orthodoxy as apophatic theology that's applicable to the essence of Father, Son, and Spirit, really what Clement is doing is identifying that unknowable essence with Father and fatherhood. And so Christ becomes this bridge by which we can know the divine, but it still seems to imply some kind of subordination. I'm not saying that it's exactly clear what Clement's view is. I'm not a Clement scholar. I'm just going by what Galwitz says on Clement and what Losky said on Clement. But the point is that you get a modification from these two guys, from Clement and Origen, about different notions of what unity is, different ideas about what's called simple unity, complex unity, relative unity. And Galwitz is very clear that the doctrine that Origen seems to hold is that multiplicity in any sense is based on creatures. So all multiplicity is bound up with the Logos. So there would be no multiplicity at all if there was not a Logos, since the Son contains all the forms, and that this is a real multiplicity. He argues that the Son has to be in some lesser status, because remember, the assumption here is that unity is higher. There's some higher level status of unity, and the identity of goodness and being, right? So it's very Plotinian. That is the essence of God. That is the Father. And so Galwitz notes that the doctrine of simplicity in Origen is the same as Eunomius' doctrine. This is page 63 in Galwitz's thesis. So this is called the identity thesis, right? The idea that, similar to modal collapse, right, that the names that we predicate of God are essentially all identical, and they're identical to the essence. For Origen, the Father is the essence. The Father is he who is. The Father has the real proper title of God, and that is identical in a way to the essence of God. So Father equals essence. Nature is person there. And this is the Eunomian doctrine, Galwitz says. God is identical to being. Being is identical to goodness, and that is the Father. Now, is the Son God? Yes, but he's a lesser God. And this will influence, again, as you pointed out, all the subordinationists afterwards, right? Arianism and so forth. Hence why in the Gospel of John, he says that we don't recognize any uncreated except the person of the Father. So everything else is on a sort of lower tier chain of being. Right? This is fundamental to understanding Hellenic philosophy, dialectics, and chain of being. So the idea that there couldn't be real distinctions, as Plotinus says in the Aeneid, distinction entails composition and division. That's a quote from the Aeneids. I can tell you exactly where it is too. It's Aeneid. If you guys want to go ahead and keep talking, you can. I've got a bunch of stuff, charts and stuff I'm going to show you. Go ahead.
Yeah, to support that point, I believe Szyszynski also espouses him as like one of the earliest, defenders of the filioque. Isn't that true?
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the earliest proponents of the filioque
Right,
doctrine
because
from
the
the same
filioque
commentary.
It's bound up with simplicity, exactly.
Yeah, and in the same commentary, he says, "We must inquire whether if it be true that all things were created through him." And he says the Holy Spirit also was created through him, right? So this is one of the things that he says in the commentary of the Gospel of John. Yeah. So there's a very early attestation. Good news for Roman Catholics. There's an early attestation for filioque. The problem is it's a heretic that's defending the filioque. So I don't know if it's a W or L for them, but yeah. There's that factor. I think in regarding to divine simplicity, this also affects his view on not only free will but also like the afterlife, right?
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah.
These are all connected. So should we like kind of should we just deal with like the very vacuum views of Origen, like how we become spheres?
Yeah, mention the really dumb stuff. I will add to by the way, it's Aeneid 3:2-16 where Plotinus says distinction is opposition. So that's fundamental to Neoplatonism. Nothing I'm saying is controversial about Neoplatonism. We have, of course, normal standard scholarship like R.T. Wallace's book, where he will note on page 104 that the comparisons between Origenism and Platonism. And so just to kind of lay out the groundwork of what the chief problem is that it's Plato, right? Platonism, Neoplatonism, these are the presuppositions of Origen and Origenism. And so the big takeaway here is that it's not about just an issue of universal salvation or apokatastasis. That's just one area of a vast system that is wrong-headed and problematic. And the Sixth Council will actually have a 4-page condemnation of the entire system of Origen, and that's why we can't accept Origenism. But let's go through, you guys do the main kind of dumb things, and then we're going to go from Genesis, Kinesis, Stasis, and we're going to compare Maximus, Augustine, and Origen and the different views that they had on these ideas.
Yeah, I think we should start with soteriology, because, as you said, the problem is the understanding of unity of Origen, and because of that, his soteriology cannot include these distinctions. So everything is a coming back to the original state.
Yeah. By the way, if you read the Dunamis book, Power of God, Michael Rene Barnes, Origen taught that the Father and the Son are autotheos. So. Page 114.
So, does he actually? The Son is autotheist?
Origen has taken pains to establish the real distinction between the Father and the Son, and that the Father and the Son are both autotheos. So, the people that go around saying this who don't even know basic Nicene Christology, that, the Synodicon, of course, condemns the idea that the Father does not communicate both the hypostasis and the divinity of the Son in generating.
Yeah. If you want to, we can just read the 15 anathemas against Origen, because it's like outlines the very vacuum views. Yeah. And we can kind of summarize it.
Should we go 1, 1, 1?
Like take turns?
Yeah, let's take turns.
To introduce his soteriology is that he believes that anything needs to come back to an original state, and that's where you get the idea of spheres, because it's supposed to show perfection. But since everything needs to go back to an original state and there's no longer distinctions, you have some ideas that you will see be reminiscent of beatific vision. It will, at the end of the day, you will, for example, say that we do not sort of have this multiplicity and individuality, because you being a partaker of God, which is something we believe, all Christians believe that, from the very beginning, Ananias said, God became man so that man can become God. But here it's becoming God in the sense of the essence, and the body is completely annihilated in Origen's worldview, and that's why you have the idea that the eschaton is just going to be a psychic experience,
like a beatific vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's take each person take a anathema.
I can start with the first one, and
Okay,
one
I'll
of you
take
guys
number
get it.
two,
Yeah.
and then
First
Snek.
one.
Okay, 3, and then J4.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
We got a lot to
let's
get
see
through,
what-
so let's just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and do it. There's a
Yeah,
lot
let's go.
tonight.
The first anathema. If anyone asserts the fabulous pre-existence of souls, fabulous fable, right? Not that it's good. Fabulous pre-existence of souls, and shall assert the monstrous restoration which follows from it, let him be anathema. So that's the first anathema.
Anathema. If anyone,
Oh, you
this
take
is-
the long one. You take number 2, Father.
Yeah, it is the long one. Isn't it?
If anyone, unless you're a scholar from Fordham or something, right?
Yeah,
the
then you're
exception
okay.
here, right?
Yeah, that. So this is number 2. If anyone shall say that the creation of all reasonable things includes only intelligence without bodies, and altogether immaterial, having neither number or name, so that there is unity between them all by identity of substance, force, and energy, and by their union with and knowledge of God, the Word, but that no longer desiring the sight of God, they gave themselves over to worse things, each one following his own inclinations, and they have taken bodies more or less suitable, and have received names. For among heavenly powers there is a difference of names, as there is also a difference of bodies. And thence some became and are called cherubims, others seraphims, and principalities and dominions, dominations, thrones, angels, and so he's obviously listing the 9 hierarchies, and many others of the heavenly orders, and let's see, as there may be, let him be anathema.
Just as a small note, when Leontius of Jerusalem critiques Leontius of Byzantium's Origenism, he actually basically says, are you going to become an angel? Like, are you going to be an enlightened angel? Or these people think they are going to be enlightened angels, as like a kind of like making fun of them. So Origen is still believed that at that time, this nonsense.
So notice in here too is the idea of unity as perfection, and any type of distinction and multiplicity is a falling away from perfection.
Yeah.
That theme's expressed in that which is anathematized.
Yeah. The third one is a bit goofy. If anyone shall say that the suns and moon and stars are reasonable beings, and that they have only become what they are because they turn towards evil, let him be anathema. It's...
All right, Jay, you got number 4.
You know
you
what
guys
might
read
be
these.
actually-
I've got Sophronius.
You know what actually might
Yeah.
be linked
Ready.
to number 3?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's actually linked to because remember the angels are associated with the sun and stars, so it's kind of a playing up on the same thing of 2, that that's the fall, and the angelic order is part of the
The
fall.
thing is,
Yeah.
like, there's clearly Neoplatonism. I don't know if if you have time to read all of them. Some are quite long, but it's the idea that you have like this primal state that's just the essence of God, and then
Yes.
things fall, things go apart, and that's where you have this idea of apokatastasis that later will be brought up.
All restored.
Everything needs
Yeah.
to come back to its original form, where there's unity of essence, substance, force,
Even
energy.
the devil.
God.
Even
Yep.
the devil.
I'm reading the 4th anathema. If anyone shall say that the reasonable creatures in whom the divine love had grown cold have been hidden in gross bodies such as ours, and have been called men, while those who have attained the lowest degree of wickedness have shared cold and obscure bodies, and are become and called demons and evil spirits, let him be anathema.
if this is number 5, if anyone shall say that a psychic condition has come from an angelic or archangelic state, and moreover that a what is
Demoniac.
that? Demoniac. Sorry,
Yeah,
my eyes.
demoniac.
I actually get my. And a human condition has come from psychic condition, and that from a human state they may become again angels and demons, and that each order of heavenly virtues is either all from those below or from those above, and below let him be anathema.
Yeah, 6. If anyone shall say that there is a twofold race of demons, of which the one includes the souls of men, and the other the superior spirits who fell to this, and that all of the number of reasonable being, there is but one which has remained unshaken in the love and contemplation of God, and that the Spirit is become Christ and the King of all reasonable beings that he has created, all the bodies which exist in heaven, on earth, and between heaven and earth, and that the world which was in itself, elements more ancient than itself, and which exist by themselves, such as dryness, damp, heat, and cold, and the image to which it was formed was so formed, and that the most holy and consubstantial Trinity did not create the world, but was created by the working intelligence which is more ancient than the world, and which communicates to its being, let him be anathema. So that's listening to Genesis. I think you could comment on this, Jay, on Origen's view of creation, maybe, because that's a problem that often comes up, and that's why you have people liking Origen quite a bit, actually.
Right. So at the Sixth Council, you have the acceptance of the confession of Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem. Right. Very influential. If you know the study of Saint Maximus's theology, then you're familiar with Saint Sophronius. They have the same doctrines, and Saint Sophronius has a confession of faith that he put forth that was accepted, not just in relation to Christology, but in terms of the doctrine of creation. And so from the outset, it rejects the doctrine of any over-allegorization or denial of the historicity of Adam, Eve, and Genesis. And so it's called the profession of faith in creation. And it talks about the Trinity, it talks about the Triune God creating the world. And it goes on to say that this had a beginning in time, it's ex nihilo. This is all against Origen, by the way, explicitly. So it goes on to say, if anyone denies the creation of souls, if anyone affirms that there was a higher realm from which we fell into bodily existence, if anyone affirms that there is an eternal possibility of falls, it says that Origen is, if anyone holds to Origen's doctrine of the resurrection, all of these things are said to be Origen's condemned fables. And so Origen is actually condemned for denying the existence of a historical Eden and a historical fall and a historical Adam and Eve. And so there's 4 pages that lists not just the condemnation of the apokatastasis, but the system of Origenism from its genesis to its end goal to its eschatology. So this is going to also play into one of the problems in the Origenist system, which is the idea that man's beatitude is in perfect stasis. It is the intellect perceiving the true essence of one or unity or the monad in that eschatological state. And so that leads to, or it just is another version of Platonism. And so that's another reason that we have to also look at the whole system is that it's not just an error on creation or the body. It's an error on Trinitarian theology, Christology, anthropology, and eschatology. And this is what leads, his doctrine of dialectical doctrine of free will is what's going to lead to his heretical notion of the eschaton, right? So he thinks that if you define free will by the choice between good and evil, you've always got to have evil, and the possibility of choosing evil, even in the eschaton, and hence eternal recurring falls.
Jay, that's a good point too. And conversely, for a lot of those that want to subscribe to apostasis, that you can't just posit that. And the working out of such a theory, you're inevitably going to be led to these other heresies, particularly this kind of eternal return, Neoplatonic thought. So I know a lot of people want to go, oh, it sounds so nice. But in order to maintain that, you're going to actually have to embrace other problematic ideas.
Yeah. I mean, the reason that they consistently call him a pagan is that it's polytheism, right? I mean, if you read the Barnes treatment about Origen and his view of the Son, there's a real confusion over the Son as power, the Son as a work. So Origen speaks of a second God, and so that God from God, light from light terminology that the Creed uses, that Athanasius uses, it's in Origen. But Origen thinks that there's another God, right? So God from God, light from light is the production of another God, a second God, right? But we don't think that there's two gods. There's only one God, namely the Father, right? And who, according to the Synodicon and the Seventh Council, communicates in generating a Son. He communicates that divinity to the Son, and that has to be stressed because that's contrary to Origen's understanding, where he actually
theos of the Son.
Well, he also says that the Father produces the Son by will. He says, and it's an eternal act of will that produces a second power or God that is the Son, that is in a subordinated status. So that's, of course, problematic because we don't think there is an interposition of will in terms of the generation of the Son, right? That's the Eunomian doctrine. And so Eunomius will actually move in a more consistent way from the Origenist assumptions and presuppositions about simplicity. Origen will repeat the Plotinian doctrine of what simplicity is. It's absolute. It's a kind of modal collapse. Any distinction that's real entails composition or division. And so in order to be consistent with the second and third hypostasis, he posits separate substances. Even though it's God from God, it's a separate God substance. And so there's a confusion there, a contradiction. And Eunomius says, well, if we're going to be consistent here, the second person, who's an act of will, is a work. He's a creature.
And notice the line that is being drawn throughout history, right? You see this. I made a video on it. I think it's the third part of my History of Christian Theology series, where I talk about the connection between Neoplatonism to Origenism to Arianism. All of these systems are connected with each other. You can say that they're basically essentially the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Arianism, a lot of people think it's just some new thing that came up. No, it has its history from Origenism, and Origenism has its history from Neoplatonism, and all of these things are connected with each other. So at the end of the day, when we're listening to Eunomius and all of these people, we're just really kind of listening to Origen, is kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. And that alone is kind of like something that we should kind of ask ourselves, how do they even come up with this kind of stuff if there is this connection? How do they go from there? But it's because Origen is not orthodox in this Trinity. It's as simple as that. And do we have any more points to make, or should we continue with the anathemas?
Go ahead with the anathemas. I don't want to get too sidetracked.
Yeah, but in terms of Genesis, yeah, exactly. That's another reason I will say is why a lot of people like Origen. I kind of want to make this comment, is that with Origenism, you can have this evolutionist view because it's congruent with Origenism, whereas if you don't have Origenism, you don't have that view. You cannot have this kind of
that's a good point.
Evolutionist view. So that's another reason why I will say a lot of people like Origen in the first place. A lot of these people is because they don't believe in creation. They believe in evolution, and they want to get away with it by using Origen as this kind of a sock puppet, as a justification. Well, look, Origen is a great guy, and he basically, according to his view of creation, I can be an evolutionist, and this is the kind of track that they want to go. So it's critical that we respond to that with, again, more Christian dogmas. You can't be Christian and an Origenist is what we're going for here. Seventh anathema says, if anyone shall say that Christ, of whom it is said that he appeared in the form of God, and that he was united before all time with God the Word, and humbled himself in these last days even to humanity, had, according to their expression, pity upon the divers falls which had appeared in the spirits united in the same unity, of which he himself is part, and that to restore them he passed through divers classes had different bodies and different names, become all to all, an angel among angels, a power among powers, has clothed himself in the different classes of reasonable beings with a form corresponding to that class, and finally has taken flesh and blood like ours and is become man for men. If anyone says all this and does not profess that God the Word humbled himself and became man, let him be anathema. So I think this means that he is saying that Christ became an angel before he became a man. Is kind of like the
Notice his,
expression I'm getting
his
at.
hierarchy of fall, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, can we?
Man would be the lowest, so he would have this idea that he has to come and pass through each hierarchy.
Yeah, this adoption of simplicity hasn't just led to this gradation and Platonic, sort of chain of being reality. It also has the chief problem here with creation that Sophronius is just passing over is the doctrine of God's creative power being a will and a choice to do it ex nihilo. And so creation isn't necessary. It's willed to be the case. But if you have the doctrine of simplicity where fatherhood is equated to the divine essence, then God has to be a father for all eternity of something or a series of created things, right? So this is the problem of eternal creation. This is the Origenist problem. You have a necessary creation, and this is based on not having the essence energy distinction and not making distinction between different types of energies. It leads directly to necessary creation because you can't distinguish between the eternal energies and attributes and the attributes that are only relating to God's will and the created order. So obviously all of the attributes and energies are not identical. They're not the same types of works, even though there's one God that's working. So this is just fundamental, a well-known problem. But we have heretics running around that don't even know this and are causing a bunch of problems. They don't even realize they're about to step into repeating Origenism.
Yeah. Great point. What are we on, number 8?
Yes.
If anyone shall not acknowledge that God the Word of the same substance with the Father and the Holy, I'm going to say Spirit because I don't like ghost, and who was made flesh and became man, one of the Trinity is Christ in every sense of the word, but shall affirm that he is so only in an inaccurate manner, and because of the abasement, as they call it, of the intelligence. If anyone shall affirm that this intelligence united to God the Word is the Christ in the true sense of the word, while the Logos is only called Christ because of this union with intelligence, and e converso, that the intelligence is only called God because of the Logos, let him be anathema.
Snek, it's your turn, my boy.
So, 9.
Yes.
If anyone shall say that it was not the divine Logos made man by taking an animated body with a rational soul and mind, that he descended into hell and ascended into heaven, but shall pretend that it is a nous which has done this, that nous of which they say in an impious fashion is Christ properly called, and that he is become so by the knowledge of the monad. So
Let him be anathema. So there's this kind of like Nestorianism kind of in these anathemas that I'm getting at. Kind of like this distinction, I feel like.
I think it would be maybe more like Apollinarian, maybe, you know, the idea that only a part of Christ, you know, did things. No?
Well, it kind of you can consider it a mixture of both, but it does make sense considering again you had many Origenists at the time that their Christology resembled Nestorius much closer than compared to Severus, right? Their Christology was 90% basically in a lot of manners similar to Nestorianism. And so anathema number 10. If anyone shall say that after the resurrection the body of the Lord was ethereal, having the form of a sphere, and that such shall be the bodies of all after the resurrection. So this is the nonsensical, idiotic sphere stuff. And that after the Lord himself shall have rejected his true body, and after the others who rise shall have rejected theirs, the nature of their body shall be annihilated. let him be anathema. So you see this kind of Mormonism, proto-Mormonism in Origen. We're just gonna become spheres, bro. We're just gonna become planets, man.
This is something you find in many places. You know, a lot of people want to, show God in an immaterial sense, or generic deities. They will often, make it like an orb of energy or something like this. There's a lot of influence for these representations of God. I think even if you look at Divine Comedy by Dante, it's like a sphere surrounded by different circles. So you have this idea that is stuck.
Yeah, these are just Hellenic assumptions that there's some higher level of perfection relating to circles and spheres over anything that it contains angles or lines, right? I mean, this is Aristotle's whole idea of the perfection of the heavenly bodies, right? Which is not true, obviously, but it's a philosophical assumption that's a presupposition that undergirds the system, and so then you have to squeeze things into that, like, again, it's not even that complicated, right? The Hellenic view has a problem with the body. Hence, they have a problem with the resurrection. Paul even says this in the New Testament, right? Greeks have a hard time with the resurrection. They think it's foolishness because they have a low view of the body. They think the body is, what did Plato say, right? Soma sema, the body is a prison.
Well, I would agree that the sphere is the most perfect geometrical of all the shapes, but I wouldn't then try to take all my metaphysics and push it down into geometry because I have something like that. So that's a typical tendency too, to kind of have, like you said, these assumptions, and whether you agree with that or not about the geometry.
Well, I would say, yeah, that's different notions of what perfection is and different types of things, right? Different categories.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're confusing categories. So geometrically, it was always argued in the ancients that, well, why is it more perfect or the perfect of all the geometrical bodies? And again, you could question this as an assumption because each part of the sphere or circle lies evenly upon. And so you have this kind of blending of aesthetics and symmetry is the idea of beauty and perfection. But again, if you then take metaphysics and say, well, it's got there's no distinction between the kind of categories of geometry and metaphysics and theology, then you've got a big mess, don't you?
Yep. So I believe. Huh?
Who's doing that?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Hello? Oh, you can hear me. Oh, wait. My camera's way down here. Are we continuing with the anathemas?
Yeah, I can't remember. Am I doing 11?
Yes.
Okay.
11.
11. If anyone shall say, anyone, that the future judgment signifies the destruction of the body and that the end of the story will be an immaterial and that will be immaterial and that thereafter there
Immaterial nature.
Yeah, will no longer be any matter but only spirit, let him be anathema. By the way, you keep noticing these kind of Gnostic themes too, of kind of the Neoplatonic kind of Gnostic themes of
nature. I have thesis in a. Yeah, but anyway, you've got this idea again. Your destruction of the body is bad. The body.
Sorry. It's psyche. Yeah, it's not nature. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I mixed up. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have thesis. So the idea is that, and that's why I was going at with the beatific vision, for example, is this belief that the body is fallen, and that only that it will be unbodied, that we
because the intellect's considered to be undivided. It's
in
be
that way, and again,
immaterial. Yeah,
it goes to say here the experience of the eschaton is just psychic, thesis, and that's the thing you'll have if you believe that you come into unity with the essence of God. And again, I'm not saying that, for example, adherence to
well, if the Son is a second God, then there's no reason why there can't be a third, fourth, fifth gods, like all of us.
Yeah, or anybody becomes
pretty much
the primordial goo, like in Genesis, Evangelion. But again, I'm not saying that the people who adhere to the beatific vision don't believe in the resurrection of body. I'm just saying that de facto
Yeah, exactly.
Since it's
Influence. There's influence from
it's
the
clear influence,
Platonic.
and it doesn't necessitate, the body, because anyway you will not use it because you can only will one good thing.
It's superfluous. You could actually make an argument, given that sort of theology, the body's superfluous, and therefore God is actually doing a superfluous act.
Yeah, and that's why there's been, this loss of the idea of sanctity of the body over time, and being accepted in the churches that were more influenced by Origen. For example, some people don't know, but in the Orthodox Church, you are not supposed to get cremated. You are not supposed to get embalmed. Because we believe in the actual resurrection of the body. Now, that doesn't mean that the bodies that are destroyed won't be raised, but that means that we need to signify that we clearly believe in the resurrection of the body, and that's why we are buried into, wooden caskets.
Yeah, it's in a way destroying God's creation, which is good. So it's kind of like I will say that's the rationale behind anti-cremationism or something like that in Orthodoxy, is that you're destroying something good.
Yeah.
Because it is created, and that's the kind of like the rationale behind it. It's not evil, and this is a presupposition that even in the iconoclast controversy, all of this kind of like is matter good, is matter evil, has been a topic in iconoclast controversy. If you don't have anything more to have, you can go on with the 12th anathema and kind of finish this.
I want to say that, I think Father Deacon, Dr. Ananias will back me up on this. I'm not an expert in ancient philosophy at all, but I've had quite a few classes in undergrad and grad school that did deal with ancient and medieval philosophy. And, I've read Plato. I've read a lot of Plato. I've read a lot of Aristotle, not as much as Father Deacon. I know Plato better than Aristotle, but there's a great section in Aristotle, East and West, by Dr. Bradshaw. It's page 26, 27, where he talks about tendencies in the Hellenic mind. I think we could see this as pretty consistent across the board, whether it's a Plotinus or a Aristotle or a Plato. I mean, we're going to see differentiations here and there between these characters, but the general attitude of the Hellenic mind is to see there being a dialectical tension, and this is going to be fundamental to understanding Origen and the presuppositions that he adopts. So in terms of the good or the perfect or the better, being is on a chain, and there's a kind of gradations and a diminution as you come down from the monad in terms of what's good. Unity thus has a higher level or status than multiplicity, So differentiation is identified as multiplicity or distinction. Remember, what did Plotinus say? Distinction is opposition. This is why the monad has to have a highest super beyond all classification, unity that can never even be identified. It can only be kind of analogously related to synonyms, This is modal collapse. So we have being, and this is better in some ontological metaphysical sense, higher than non-being. This is the Greek chain of being, This is their move. Unity is preferable, better, more perfect than dyad, triad, multiplicity. Now, if you know Maximus's arguments on the Trinity, there's no primacy to unity itself, And multiplicity here just means a different sense of not multiple substances, but differentiation, real distinction. That's all multiplicity here means. Look at Maximus's argument about the movement from monad to dyad to triad. Rest is seen to be superior to motion. Motion is a feature of the lower orders underneath the celestial spheres. The celestial spheres are perfect circles. They move in a circular motion, and therefore they're a higher level of reality than we are. And ultimately, the one, the monad, the unmoved mover, is in perfect rest, So even though he is pure actuality, he possesses perfect rest according to Aristotle. Well, it's more of an it, not a he, Motion is a characteristic of what's moved by the unmoved mover, Mind, superior to body. Body is a lower prison type of status. So this is a common dialectic that you will find, and I've been reading about this for 15, 20 years. It's not, this shouldn't even be controversial. It should be obvious that this is how the Hellenic mindset sees things. And what I'm saying is that when we come to the Trinity, when we come to the doctrine of man's will, when we come to eschatology, anthropology, this is going to upset and go contrary to the theology of the church and the councils. And Origen is going to adopt these Hellenic presuppositions, and they're going to condition his whole system. This is all you need to understand and see, that this will condition Origenism, and this is the root of why Origenism is such a problem. And on top of that, scholars themselves, it's not even controversial. Gawitz has multiple sections where he says that this is the same doctrine of simplicity that Aquinas and Augustine adopt. Augustine adopts the doctrine of simplicity that Origen has. Yeah. Aquinas adopts the doctrine of simplicity that Augustine has. So there's a direct lineage from Origen, from Plotinus, Origen, Augustine, about what simplicity is. And we're going to see in a minute what that is. I'm going to give you the quotes. I'm not just saying.
You notice we've talked about this a million times.
Yeah, but they don't listen because they don't know what they're talking about.
In those paradigms, they start with several Hellenistic assumptions.
Yeah.
Essentialism. They begin with the one and unity above all things, and then you work out your system from there. But you don't see that in the Fathers. You see that in order to understand the one essence of God, it always exists in the mode of persons. Persons, the hypostasis, the Holy Trinity is always presented first in the order of theology. So it's in complete opposition to those projects.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
Okay, number 12, another one on unity. If anyone shall say that the heavenly powers and all men and the devil and evil spirits are united with the word of God in all respect, as the nous, which is by them called Christ, and which is in the form of God, and which humble itself, as they say. And if anyone shall say that the kingdom of Christ shall have an end, let him be anathema.
All right, this is number 13. If anyone shall say that Christ, i.e. the nous, is in no wise different from other reasonable beings, neither substantially, nor by wisdom, nor by his power and by its might over all things, but that all will be placed at the right hand of God, as well as he is that is called by them, as well as he that is called by them Christ, the nous, as also they were in the feigned pre-existence of all things, let him be anathema.
14. If anyone shall say that all reasonable beings will one day be united in one, when the hypostasis as well as the number and the bodies shall have disappeared, and that the knowledge of the world to come will carry with it the ruin of worlds, the rejection of bodies, as also the abolition of all names. Here's the pluralities being destroyed, and that there shall be finally an identity of the hypostasis, so the one. Moreover, that in this pretended apostasis, spirits will only continue to exist as it was feigned pre-existence, let him be anathema. So there's the first kind of apostasis that we get and kind of explanation of why he believes all will be saved. All spirits, all human beings, all bodies, return to the one and saved. Apostasis. If you believe that, you're anathema.
So there's finally an identity of the gnosis and the hypostasis. So again, you have this return to the original form, and like in your knowledge and in your hypostasis.
Now, I can anticipate the objection, by the way, and we can talk about this after the anathemas. Let's say somebody says, well, that's just only one type of apostasis. Like, obviously, that's wrong. But we could have others that are acceptable. So let's just keep that on the back burner, and then we'll talk about why that's impossible.
Mm-hmm. And define anathema, Snek. You can. I think it's yours. Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone shall say that the life of the spirit shall be like should be like to the life which was in the beginning, while yet the spirits had not come down and fallen, so that the end and the beginning shall be alike, and that the end shall be the true measure of the beginning. Let it be anathema. So yeah, that's a good summary of apokatastasis.
By the way, let me add too, because there is an edict given from the Council of Constantinople in 543 that will actually state. So this is just to kind of answer, and then we can get in more detail about, well, what if that's just that type of apostasis? I think the edict from the Council of Constantinople here makes it quite clear. Whoever says or thinks that the punishment of demons and the wicked will not be eternal, let him be anathema. So that pretty much covers every possible type of apostasis theory you could have.
Right, so should we get into apokatastasis itself, or to St. Maximus's and Origen's view?
I'd just like to add, about the apokatastasis and the ideas that there are different apokatastasis and that some are not condemned. There's another set of anathema in this council that are the anathema of Emperor Justinian.
Yes.
And the ninth one says sensibly what Father Deacon Dr. Ananias said. If anyone should say or think that the punishment of demons and of impious men is only temporary and will one day have an end, and that restoration, apokatastasis, will take place of demons and of impious men, let him be anathema to Origen, and to that Adamantius, which is a surname of Origen.
Yeah, Snek, I forgot to mention that was actually the Emperor.
There's a couple points I want to bring in here that, again, remember his apokatastasis relates to his pre-existent soul doctrine. So in Origen's doctrine of sin, there's varying degrees due to distinctions in the created order. The cause of diversity among creatures, beings, is shown to be derived from the unfairness on the part of the not on the part of the disposer, but according to their own actions. These actions inhibit varying degrees of earnestness or laxity according to the goodness or badness of each. Now, since the world is so very varied and comprises a diversity of beings, what else can we assign to the cause of its existence except the diversity of the fall? So the reason that there's diversity, the reason that there's movement away from the one, is because beings willed to move their gaze away from the one, and then they fell into a bodily existence. There would be no diversity because multiplicity, diversity, distinctions are viewed as a lesser ontological status. And that's so this is on First Principles book 1, section 8, book 1, section 8, 1 and 2, book 2, section 1 and 1, book 2, section 9 and 2. And you'll see that he consistently has this dialectical opposition of the pre-existent state of unity and then the fall into multiplicity.
Yep. And on the topic of apokatastasis, I think a good way to kind of summarize, like, how does he even come to this kind of view? I think
because
I'm going to give like
confuses nature and person.
Exactly, and I kind of want to give the basic rundown of how I see this. So we have to again bear in mind that I will even add that your doctrine on simplicity affects your view on the afterlife because of the distinction as opposition view. He has this kind of dialectical view of free will, where good and evil are opposites, that they both exist as opposites, and free will is defined as good versus evil. So if you miss either good or evil, if you don't have one of those things, you don't have free will. And in heaven, you have free will, he will have to say. And so if you can in the afterlife have that free will, evil has to exist, which is why you can fall from the good at that afterlife. So all of these doctrines are in a way connected with each other. The simplicity doctrine, the free will doctrine, and the afterlife, all of these kind of are connected. So if you basically, like, if he had our view of divine simplicity, orthodox view of divine simplicity, it will be very difficult for him to have the universalist views that he has, right? Or the views of free will that he has. And that's another aspect. And in terms of other apokatastasis, we will only have to look at St. Maximus the Confessor, where there is a universal restoration of all nature, but that does not mean that all persons are restored. They are restored in the sense that their natures are restored and on the way that they live their life. So a good analogy will be someone who lived their entire life hating God, when they reunite with God, what do you think is going to be happening to them? Do you think they're going to be, oh, I hated you all my life, but, now I'm happy? No, he's still going to hate that experience because his will, the way he lived his life, his mode of willing is going to carry over to the next life. And whether in this life he lived a life of well-being or ill-being is going to determine his experience in the afterlife. So yes, there is this kind of, technically speaking, there is this kind of restoration, and you can even say salvation, but the experience of that is going to be distinct, right? The experience is going to be based on how you will and how you kind of lived your life, you can say. This is not in Origen, right? This is in St. Maximus. He talks about this more in detail. The way I see it is kind of like the basic way, so it can be, I guess, interpreted as wrong, but that's kind of how I see it. I've also dealt with it more extensively in a previous video myself, but this is, again, this distinction of the view of free will is another aspect of this is I forgot. Is that free will is not a dialectical choice between good and evil. It's just having multiple different choices. So there's this distinction as well in terms of how you view free will. So if you only have good things to will in the afterlife, you still have free will because you can will between multiple divine energies of God. Right. And this is also why you need the distinctions between God's divine energies. If you say the energies are always only one and cannot never,
repeat
the divine
that once
energies
more for the audience. One more time.
the divine energies have to be distinct and multiple for you to will multiple good things. If it's only one, if you're Roman Catholic or if you're a mentally ill person, you say the divine energy is only one and they're not distinct with each other, then you still go into the Origenist problem, right? Because there is no multiple things to will,
which is one thing. So
and you don't have a free will.
So this presupposes that the one divine energy is also has distinctions in it.
Absolutely, yeah. Yep. I mean, is eternal love identical to the to divine providence? Right.
Yeah,
that's the Origen doctrine. Origen says that being Father is equivalent to being Creator, is equivalent to providence, and so not only is he eternally a Father of the Son, he's also eternally Lord and providential of an eternal creation. And that's because the attributes, the actions, the energies are all the same in the modal collapse doctrine. By the way, Galwitz says it's not even controversial.
Yeah, think of the stupidity of this view. Like when Christ walks on water, which is an action of both of his energies, right? But when you say Christ walks on water, is he creating the world when he's walking on water? I mean, how silly is this even? Like who
they're really distinct actions. I mean, nobody
yes,
but
exactly.
Completely untrained, stupid people would say this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
And actually, that's very interesting because this argument is from Saint Basil, letter 38, that is attributed to Saint Gregory of Nyssa. So, Saint Gregory of Nyssa and Saint Basil, who saw Origen in high regard, do not fall into this trap. So that's a good example of someone being inspired by Origen, but still only taking what's good. And Origen summarized a lot of great things. And I'd like to answer maybe an interrogation that many people have, which is to say, for catechesis or for church history or for whatever, we are being given Origen to read. Should we read it? And that's very interesting because if you look at some church father, you will see that you have the vision of Saint Basil, that is to say, we can just pick up what's good, so you can read it carefully. And there's a vision of Saint Hilary, for example. For Tertullian, he would say, Tertullian said great things, but I don't want to quote him. I think we should probably not be afraid of reading some of Origen's works, but be extremely careful and cross-check it and so on.
Yeah,
so that's why it summarizes a lot of good things.
Before you read Origen, read the Church Fathers. is what I will say, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
so like in the shaft set, you have De Principiis, right? You have on first principles, and you can see very quickly within the first few chapters, book 1, chapter 5, 6, 7, he gives his doctrine of simplicity, and it's very clear, very very concise, very. It's not really in dispute what he thinks is going on, right? The Father is identical to this unknowable essence. The words that we use of God are essentially synonyms. And so this is called the identity thesis, right? This is what we mean by absolute divine simplicity. And as Galwitz says, this doctrine goes on into Augustine and Aquinas. They both adopt the same doctrine of simplicity. So what are the kind of like metaphysical implications of this doctrine? Well, some of the things that you could point out is that if this is a modal collapse or a big equals sign, then really all of the names that we name of God are just naming the same thing, and they don't really have any clear difference between them. There's only a conceptual distinction between eternal love and providence, right? So what applies to God eternally is also applicable to God in terms of creation and the created order. So either God's eternality is created, which doesn't make any sense, or the created order is an eternal creation, right? Because you've made them all synonymous, right? So creation is not ex nihilo at a point in time, it's eternal, right? This is why he equates fatherhood with essence, fatherhood with eternity, fatherhood with providence. They're all the same. They all mean the same thing. They're predicates of one identical thing, right? All of those names are just naming one identical thing. And for him, the distinctions, and I think it's Barnes or Galwitz has a whole discussion of kat epinoia in Origen. And kat epinoia is the idea of conceptual distinctions, and in the Church Fathers, there's both, right? So just because you make a conceptual distinction doesn't mean it's only a conceptual distinction. You can have something that's conceptual and real, or only conceptual and not real. There's a lot of different possibilities, and then into the Middle Ages, there's a whole theory of different notions of distinctions that occur, especially amongst the scholastics. Bradshaw has a really lengthy essay on the kat epinoia distinctions in the Middle Ages. But the Orthodox view is, if you look back at St. Basil, is just simply that you can have something that's a mental distinction that also corresponds to a real distinction in reality. So when we say that there's a distinction between these attributes, it doesn't mean it's only conceptual or logical or virtual, right? That's the Thomistic view, that they're not real, right? They are real distinctions because they're really distinct energies. There's real distinctions between the Father and the Son, right? The distinctions between the hypostases are not strictly kat epinoia. They're kat epinoia and real.
Maybe we should address one criticism, when oftentimes when you attack the idea of apokatastasis, people bring up Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and we would say that it was an error. We would say that Saint Maximus the Confessor explained in what sense we can understand it. What would you say if someone brought up Saint Gregory of Nyssa?
Well, the first thing I will say is that to know what is true doctrine, we talked about this in the stream against Roman Catholicism, is that you need the universality, you need consensus of that doctrine, and you need all of the patriarchs to kind of agree on this doctrine. And first of all, in terms of consensus, one church father is not consensus. I mean, even if you take like the worst possible scenario, there's only one church. Maybe you can find. Let me give them a freebie and give them 2-3 church fathers, 2-3 saints that, let's say, hypothetically believe in universalism. That's still not consensus. Okay, that is still not consensus. So, it's a weak argument. We had church fathers that you could say, for example, Saint Augustine, obviously, in terms of filioque and whatnot. For example, Saint Cyril of Alexandria uses Miaphysis formula, and it is used in the Orthodox Church, but is it used as if like regularly? No, the Diophysite formula has more precedence, right? But we still don't So in general, like the church fathers, just one church father saying something doesn't mean that the entire church. So if you don't believe in like one church father is magically infallible. So even in that case, and in terms of like whether he really believes in it, again, I haven't read that kind of stuff. So I'm not gonna make comments. You guys know it better than me, but I've heard some people kind of contest that claim. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
What do you guys have to say about
are
that?
we going to just pick every church father's differing canon for several centuries? Of course not.
Yes.
Right, you
You know
can't-
what it reminds me of? The Protestant modus operandi.
Yeah.
That you start with yourself, which is the very essence of heresy. So it's not the consensus and what's been received, but let me start with myself, and then I'll go through and pick the church fathers that I want to build a case. This
Yeah.
is kind of secular philosophy and academia works. I'll go through the literature, and then I'll make my case. That's not how we work in Orthodoxy. It's what's received, it's consensus, it's the councils. So if that could be shown, and like you said, David, let's leave that up to more of the experts on Gregory Nyssa to actually explain what he means there. But let's say he does. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what church fathers you can find that say that's not how we operate.
Yeah, we would say that as demonstrated by Letter 38, Saint Gregory of Nyssa doesn't espouse the entire system.
Yeah, good
There
point.
might be some remnants here and there, and even then we have Saint Maximus that explains that to an extent we can believe in a regeneration, in a return to a previous state, which is the general recapitulation of bodies, but not Origen's greater reset.
Right. Exactly.
The Great Reset of Origin.
There's a couple things I want to read here. So if you look at this is relevant and enlightening. Let me see the citations here. Let's see. In Plotinian Neoplatonism, the idea that the one has no choice to produce either the beings that emanate from it or not, it was rather a situation that it is good, the one, and it has to overflow the bounds of its divine goodness to produce the manifold of creation. So due to this definition of simplicity, there's not really any distinctions from the one, since the one's being, activity, and will are wholly indistinguishable. And this is in Plotinus in the Aeneads 1:6-6. In Origenism, we have a similar compulsion that occurs with two explicit manners. One is on the theological and other on the eschatological level. God being the Father is wholly indistinguishable from being creator. Therefore, just as he always begot a son, so he always willed the creation. On the eschatological level, at the level of human free choice, the Origenist doctrine of apokatastasis excludes any notion of continued creaturely free will, unless, of course, there is the possibility of recurring and successive falls in the eschaton, which means, of course, that free will is defined dialectically as the opposition between good and evil. So you get this, obviously, then that's the end result, and that's why you can't adopt this system. And the whole system is predicated on the idea that beings as multiplicity are opposed to the one and its simplicity. And that's Aeneid 5:1-5. And this is critiqued in Losky, Mystical Theology, page 30. You can go back to, so in the Wallace book, page 91 to 104 in the Wallace book on Neoplatonism. And let me just point out what Wallace says. On the Platonic side, later Neoplatonist doctrine of the immortality of the soul referred to its subtle astral body. This seemed to offer hope of bridging the gulf between Christianity and Neoplatonism. But the contrast between the body and man's gross terrestrial body was still too sharply drawn by pagans to be acceptable to Christian orthodoxy. And while a standing temptation to the Platonizing thinkers, the doctrine was ultimately condemned as Origenistic at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. The doctrine of the divine incarnation in its Christian form was unacceptable to Orthodox Neoplatonism, not Orthodox, but the strict Neoplatonist thinkers, not the Orthodox thinkers, the Neoplatonist thinkers, on many grounds. For one, Porphyry thought that in regard to Jesus as a righteous man, he could be admitted into heaven because of his virtue. But it was impossible for him to conceive of the possibility of the one entering into time and space, right? The one can't become God, become man and enter into time and space. That's impossible to what the one is, right? And so this seems to be a concern. And then he goes on to say that thus the Platonist repugnance toward the idea of a divine union with an unclean fleshly body was the crucial departure here. So it's not just a matter of the one and the many and all that stuff. That's relevant here in terms of the Platonic Hellenic assumptions. But remember, it also undercuts the incarnation, and that's why I'm going to call out Phaser, because Phaser says that he can argue from the Neoplatonic doctrine of God that the one that we recognize in natural theology is outside of time and space, unchangeable, and can't enter into time and space, or else he would be subject to change. So that means that Dr. Phaser's Thomistic philosophy undercuts, his Neoplatonic Thomistic philosophy undercuts the incarnation. Do you see what I'm getting at here, right? In other words, the incarnation is really impossible if you have these presuppositions.
Yeah, how can there be a unity of the two natures?
Exactly.
If you have this view, we can't.
And every time there's a heretic, right? So all of the councils are arguing Hellenic dialectics. That's the key to all the councils, whether it's Marcion. By the way, Galwitz points out that the simplicity doctrine of Marcion is absolute. The good God is the God of the New Testament, the God of love. He's the nice God. He actually has a doctrine of simplicity that passes on into probably Origen, according to Galwitz. So, I mean, again, why does Marcion think that? Because there's a dialectical tension between the mean God of the Old Testament and the nice God of the New. It's dualism.
Yep. And if you don't have any more comments, I want to kind of also make some additions in regarding to icons. Now, this might be strange to some people. What does Origen have to do with icons? Well, first off, Origen is an iconoclast. Let me quote, Origen was an iconoclast. He likewise rejects without distinction every depiction of the divine. This includes the Son of God. He says this in Contra Celsum 3 and De Principiis. So he is an iconoclast of his time, but there's something even more to it. His presuppositions have carried over to the iconoclastic presuppositions. Now, this is especially told in Father Ambrosius Iacalis' book, Images of the Divine, the Theology of Icons at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and he points out throughout the book that there is this kind of Origenistic presupposition in the iconoclasts. And this is due to various definitions. So first of all, the lack of a distinction between person, nature, energy, right? These are not distinguished in that system. So that's one of the issues. And because of a lack of a distinction, there is a different understanding of form, whereas he points out that the Pauline understanding of form refers to nature or substance. Their understanding of form is something else. So for example, their understanding of icon is Origenistic. They will say that icon and the thing that is the thing that's representing and the thing being represented is actually considered kind of the same thing. That's why they will say that the Eucharist is an icon, right? The iconoclasts will say the Eucharist is an icon, but it's also the body and blood of Christ. So it is an icon representing Christ. It is also the Christ himself. Another aspect is that the understanding of people in heaven becoming intelligible, right? This kind of people becoming intelligible, and let me get the exact understanding.
Becoming angels.
Yeah, for the iconoclast, it is inconceivable that one shall transfer intelligibles or intelligible reality to the sensible world and thus make them accessible to the uninitiated and profane. And so in this understanding, because of this, we cannot even depict the intelligibles, and because when we die we become intelligible, the saints become intelligibles. You cannot depict the saints, you cannot depict Christ, you cannot depict any of this. And so this is kind of the Origenistic presupposition that iconoclasts have, and I do kind of plan on making this video on iconography and kind of more extensively, but there is an Origenistic understanding, presupposition behind iconoclasm. So And it's not just the fifth or the sixth council that Origenism was a headache. Even in the seventh council, Origenism was a headache.
Yeah,
And
right.
some people, he points out, that iconophiles, some of them even do understand this, or that yes, this, we're dealing with Origenism, we're dealing with a different form of Origenism. And again, another thing is about like the lack of a diversity of energies. All of this kind of stuff is dealt with the issue of icons. So when you look at it, and this is kind of what I want to summarize it with, when you look at Origenism, everything in the seven ecumenical councils, everything that the ecumenical councils deal with, and I will even say the eighth and the ninth, right? Because of hesychasm, Origenism is against it. Anti-filioque, Origen is pro-filioque. You look at all of these councils, everything goes contrary to what Origen believed. And Origen, as we said before, really believes what Neoplatonism says for him to believe. So in general, to be an Origenist is not to deny just the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh ecumenical. It's really to deny Christian truth in general. If you're an Origenist, if you're defending Origen, you're not just defending some person, you are attacking an entire Christian system. And so to be an Origenist is to deny being a Christian, is what I will kind of like to summarize this with, and why this is kind of like a fatal issue for us to deal with, because this is so popular. For very bad reasons that I explained, because people want to believe in heretical doctrines such as evolution and all of that kind of stuff.
So I want to say, if we look at some of the summations of the Neoplatonic and the Origin-based systems, you get dialectics of opposition. Divine essence is defined as simplicity in a definitional sense, in an identity thesis sense. Beings, in terms of their multiplicity, are in a lower status, and they are opposed to the one and its simplicity. That is Aeneid 5:1-5. Beings are, in a sense, evil, and therefore are opposed to good. And that is, that's the same section. And then in First Principles, this is Origen 1:8-1. Multiplicity and composition are evil, and simplicity and unity are the higher good. The good, paradoxically, is always static, solitary, circumscribable, and a unitary principle. Remember what I just showed you in that chart of the dialectic, right? That Bradshaw talks about. It's very, very common ideas here. But since multiplicity is related to evil, free choice relates to evil, as we've seen. Neither Origen nor Plotinus has a one that chooses to create by his will. Rather, since multiplicity arises as a choice of the beings leaving their stasis and perfect unity with the one. There is no distinction between the principle of distinction of multiplicity, between the principle of distinction of multiplicity and the principle of opposition. Thus, you get an equation where opposition equals distinction, as we saw from the Aeneids. This remains a common formula to Neoplatonic, Origenists, and other heretical groups. Now, this can be summarized again as in the Plotinian Neoplatonism, beings are logically evil, both because they move and because they are multiple. In Origenism, this position is mitigated, for beings in the primordial hynad could be construed as evil because multiple, but good because they are fixed in stasis around the one. Before the fall, they were in contemplation of the one. These fixed beings, however, could also choose to leave that status and then fall into being creatures in a bodily existence. So that's the problem here, is that we have all of these assumptions of Platonism, Neoplatonism, simplicity, right? And that's what's completely destructive to the entire Christian enterprise in terms of biblical theology and what's revealed in Scripture. So it's a completely foreign pagan system. It has nothing to do with Christianity. It's utterly, by the way, ridiculous. I'll put this little chart, if I can get this to show up here. Might not be able, let me see. I'm going to try to make this chart come on the screen here. You guys can go ahead and keep talking.
Yes, Snek, go ahead, and then I'll finish after you.
So I'd have a comment that many people might be asking themselves, why is there pushes to rehabilitate Origen? Mm-hmm. Why is it so popular today? And the answer is that there's a few reasons, actually. First of all, Origen is very famous among the Protestants because it allows them to have an authority that is early, that goes against tradition.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
It allows it allows people at large to erode the authority of the Fifth Council. And the Fifth Council is especially important. If you look at the authority of the Fifth Council, only the Orthodox can really fully adhere to it. It's a council during which Pope Vigilius is deposed. He admits that he followed the heretical 3 chapters. It's a council during which he specifically said that Augustine need to be read according to his retraction, that we should be careful about this. It's a council where you had the emperor having an important place. So for a lot of the secularists, people want to make a complete split. They would point to this as the emperor overstepping. So the Fifth Council is crucial. It's also, important in Oriental Orthodox, in the Oriental Orthodox debate, because they will say that the Fifth Council actually disproves the authority of Chalcedon because it came after. No, the Fifth Council actually gives a proper reading of Chalcedon. So it varies. This council is a key, and eroding it is deleterious. Then you have other things. Academia loves Origen because it erodes tradition. Protestant loves Origen because it erodes tradition. It's also very good for ecumenism because Origen would be this universal figure who brings a universal understanding of soteriology. If you think about it, apokatastasis is just the soteriology of ecumenism. It's a soteriology of, we don't actually care so much. Everybody's going to be saved at the end. Everybody's nice. Everybody's good. So that's why it's being used quite a bit. I don't know if you have comments on this, but a lot of people are complaining, and this video was made because we actually had complaints about people shilling for Origen.
Yeah, I kind of, if no one else has a comment, Father Deacon, do you have any comments?
Oh, I just wanted to make a few arguments and comments about apostasis. I don't know if that's taken it off track again.
Well, before you do that,
Jay, why don't you do that?
Yeah, let me run through. So this chart's really good to kind of summarize what the issues at play are. And if you look on the left, so we look at Origen's system. In terms of simplicity, God is one, simple, and immutable. Therefore, God's goodness equals his immutability. God is not therefore free to create or to not create. In the Augustinian scheme, God is one and simple and immutable, and to be true is to be, and to be is to be great. Ergo, to be true is to be great. God's will is his essence, but he still is free in somehow to create or not to create, though this does not necessarily follow from the premise. In St. Maximus, God is one and simple, but not in the sense that the energies or attributes of God are identical. Hence, he does not hold to the identity thesis of Origen. His attributes equal each other only in the sense that they are equally divine. God is able to create because his will is not the same thing as his essence. And so we see that the people who, like Roman Catholics, identify God's actions as all identical and the same and one, are basically just making the Origenist argument. If we look at the notion of his doctrine of creation, we get stasis. But pre-existent souls are able to choose the fall or not to fall. This is Origen, remember. And this choice is dialectically defined as a choice between good and evil. In the Genesis account of Augustine, so this would be like Origen's doctrine of Genesis is stasis. Augustine's doctrine of Genesis, souls are created, but they're able to choose between good and evil. In Maximus's doctrine, souls do not pre-exist, and they're able to choose from several alternatives, but these are not necessarily evil. So we have the possibility of multiple goods to be willed. And so you'll notice that Maximus's doctrine is a key departure, not just from Origen, but also from Augustine, who still retains somewhat of a dialectical definition of free will, even though he wants to admit free will. In Kinesis over here with Origen, as God is good and immutable and simple, any multiplicity and motion are inherently evil. So the created order is really identical to or related to whatever is lower in being, lower on the chain, and in some sense evil. In Augustine, Kinesis involves two foci, right? The doctrine of sin, right? And the doctrine of conversion. and the choice in either case is dialectically defined, right? Because it's what we saw here, that souls are created but able to choose between good and evil. So he still has the dialectical notion of free will here. In Maximus, this involves two different foci. Man is able to choose freely amongst several goods by nature, and the fall dialectically conditions all choices in this world, but this moral dilemma is not the natural condition of choice, right? So there's a difference between the state of man's will, the mode of man's will, in the sense of what was proper to him in the garden, and then after the fall, the post-lapsarian process is not identical to the pre-lapsarian process. The nature is the same, but we're not going to, for example, in the eschaton, have a choice between good and evil, whereas after the fall, we do have that choice. So in the eschaton, it'll be more like it was in Eden, except it'll be better because there won't be the possibility of choosing evil. For Origen, Genesis, the fall into diversity and materiality. So the fall of man in Genesis is out of unity and stasis into diversity, materiality, and motion. These stupid Hellenic dialectics are not part of our theology. For Augustine, in the eschatological presence of God's absolute simplicity. So there's a kind of beatific vision doctrine here in Augustine where there's an absolute simplicity where man is not able to choose, for there are no real multiple objects to choose from. The beatific vision means, as for example Aquinas says, the intellect is fully satiated with the essence of God and therefore would never choose to will anything different. There's nothing else to will because there's no real multiplicity in the eschaton. So you don't have free will anymore. In the eschaton, in terms of Saint Maximus, the saints are able to choose amongst multiple equal goods. And so there has to be a reality to the multiplicity of things to will, not just creatures, but also different things to will in the sense of God. Maximus says that in the eschaton, we will be willing and seeing and perceiving the many logi. So if you don't believe that the logi are distinct and the logi are energies, then you're not perceiving and willing different things. So this chart is helpful. It kind of just lays it all out in a pretty clear way, what the different systems are here. And as Orthodox, obviously, we will go in the direction of the 6th and 7th Council, right? The direction of St. Maximus. And we don't adopt all of these presuppositions of Augustine, even though we think Augustine is a saint. That doesn't mean, just like with Gregory of Nyssa, we don't believe every single thing he says.
Let me pick up on that. It's really good. Kind of the points I wanted to make concerning the nature of will on the Orthodox understanding. And as David had brought up and St. Maximus talks about as well, the choices that we make based on what will actually is forms our character, and in the eschaton, how we'll experience that. I know, David, you talked about that. And so in light of that, in light of what Jay just had here on the chart, I'd like to ask people, because a lot of people say that, well, wouldn't it be just great though? Can we just hope God would be so good that in the end, all would be restored and saved? I think that's a huge presumption. My question would be, by any means necessary? So, do the ends justify the means? In order to get to that, you would have to either destroy free will or pervert the very notion of will itself as exemplified in the chart here. So I actually make an argument that that's just an unfounded assumption that would be better. In fact, I would argue from all the evidence that we had that if God did something like that, that would be much worse than if all were saved.
Yeah.
I mean, if all were saved, that would be much worse than if actually some experience damnation based on the choices they made, forming their characters to experience the eschaton and God's glory, either as, eternal torment or eternal bliss. So again, when you start to work out these details and you start to question your paradigms, you start to realize that these have implications that would actually, and it's funny because people will always say, well, I don't want to worship a God that, you know, allows people to go to hell. Why don't we just turn it back? I don't want to worship a God that would have to do the stuff that he would do to save everybody. Like, that seems like a terrible God. Like,
I will also add, I mean, first of all, in Scripture, it is said that 1 Timothy 2:4 that God wants everyone to be saved, to come to the knowledge of truth. But there's a couple of problems if we go with the Origenistic interpretation, the Universalist interpretation. Number one, I will say, is that this is monophyletic, because you're basically, if everyone is going to be saved because God wants everyone to be saved, if that's the argument, that's a monophyletic argument. And that's a... I think monistic argument. I forgot the exact term of it, but I think it's monist. Yeah, I think monistic argument, because we will say, for example, let's say that, yeah, as you said, let's say that God just handpicks everyone and puts them in heaven. First of all, someone, again, with the previous example I gave, someone who lived his life, who willed in his life to hate God, do you think he's gonna enjoy God's presence when he like experiences it in full? He won't. It's actually going to be much worse for him. That, like, ironically, hell will be better for him. Is a better experience for him, because he will experience something much worse.
and
There's
it's
a problem
strange
of that.
too,
Yeah.
if we take the very, and I'm not going to name it because I don't want to be crude or anything like that, but all of you can have examples in your mind of the very worst type of people. You're saying that's good, that they would actually be able to participate in paradise in the same way and be restored. There's, again, it's all to emphasize, in order to accomplish what you think would be good, that all were saved, would allow and imply certain evils, is my argument. And in fact, do you know that a lot of the holy elders and fathers talk about, even if that were true, apostasis, you should never believe it, ever. It's destructive it destroys your motivation to work your salvation out in fear and trembling. And some people might say, well, can't we hope for, and I used to think that, but then I was thinking, look, I think we could desire that all could be saved or would be saved like God does, but to hope against dogma seems strange, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, I just hope that there is no. I mean, imagine if
I hope the Bible is wrong.
Yeah, I hope there is no resurrection, right? You can't hope against dogma. I think you could have a desire like God does. I have a desire that all be saved, but we know that all won't be saved. In order to actually achieve that, you would create far more evil than if you didn't.
Yeah,
That's
and
my
like,
argument.
and the divine will have to override the human will in the eschaton, because everyone's, for them to be saved, right? And this will also imply in Christology, then Christ's divine will have to overpower by force and subordinate the human will,
Yes.
thus ending in monothelitism, right? So
See
the
all
doctrine.
yep.
So
Yeah, and
the
something
Sixth
else.
Ecumenical Council is dealing with this issue as well. So it's not just Christology; it's also about the afterlife. It's also about eschatology when it's dealing with these issues. And this is, and more reasons are the reasons why this is kind of untenable and impossible, I will say.
Yeah, and that's also a big problem, again, in regard to Genesis, because one of the way to solve the problem of evil, why is there evil in the world, even though God is omnipotent, is that we chose this evil because we had the opportunity to choose it. And if God had destroyed this opportunity, this free will in human to choose it, it would have destroyed a part of the image and likeness of God which he created. So it would have been more evil for us not to have the choice of picking up, the apple and biting it, the fruit and biting it.
Because there will be no theosis at the end of the
Exactly.
day.
So that's a denial of theosis. That's a denial of Genesis. That's a denial of the old system we live in. The entire point of Christianity is to solve this fall. And here you are in a system which cannot even accept it.
Oh, Jay, we can't hear you.
I'd like to add, too, that if we read the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, this is yet another product of the condemnation of these errors. So, again, it's not just, Fifth and Sixth Council, which are very important, but it's not just the Seventh Synod mentioning Origen. The Synodicon, which is supposed to be, read throughout the church, a lot of times the bishops will still read it. It says, to those who profess piety yet shamelessly, or rather impiously, to introduce into the Orthodox Catholic Church the ungodly doctrines of the Greeks concerning the souls of men, heaven and earth, and the rest of creation, anathema. Right? So this is Origenism. To them who prefer the foolish wisdom of secular philosophers and follow its proponents, and who accept the metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, or that, like the brute animals, that the soul is destroyed and departs into nothingness, or who deny the resurrection and the judgment and the final recompense, right? This is Origenism. Anathema. To those who dogmatize the doctrine of the ideas, that matter and the ideas are without beginning or co-eternal with God. This is Origenism, Platonism. The creator of all, right? The denial of the free ex nihilo creation. Then they are anathema, right? And so, to those who maintain that the wise men of the Greeks and the foremost heresiarchs who were put under anathema by the seven councils and by the fathers, set forth as aliens to the Catholic Church because of the adulterations and loathsome superabundance of the error of their teachings, yet they are exceedingly more excellent. And it goes on to say anathema, right? So if you prefer Plotinus and the philosophers to the judgment of the councils and the condemnation, and it specifies what doctrines it's condemning, you're anathema. And let's add as well that in the Synodicon, you also have the rejection of those who teach that the Son is autotheos, right? Who don't believe that the Father essentially and hypostatically, right? This is relates to Origenism, because Origen, as we said, has a weird contradictory doctrine of the Father and the Son as autotheos, as Barnes notes. So what do we say to people who deny the Nicene Creed, that the Father both hypostatically and essentially, right, generates? Well, it's anathema. So anyone who's telling you the Calvinist doctrine of autotheos, and even if they don't even realize that it's a Calvinist doctrine, you'll notice, what does the Synodicon say, right? The Holy Spirit proceeds out of the Father essentially and hypostatically, as Christ says in the Gospel. So the Father communicates. It's impossible that the Father could generate an hypostasis without a nature.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to, like you mentioned, he says the Father and the Son are autotheos, which is like, wait, bro, you said he's created, now you say autotheos? Like, what's going on with your mind? Like, are you... Is there a psychological Nestorianism going on there?
That's why it's polytheism. I mean, remember, Origen is attributing to creation eternality. Right? There's a cyclical view of creation because of Platonism here. Mm-hmm. And that's because there's not a distinction between the types of acts in God. There's no difference between generating a son and creating the world. They're both eternal actions.
And I kind of want to make a small comment because there's going to be people that's going to say, well, aren't the church fathers Platonists? And as well, the distinction is a very subtle but a very important distinction. The church fathers, you could say, use these concepts to explain Christian truths, or what Origen does is substitute Christian truths with Platonic concepts. So there's a huge difference between what's going on. Like, I mean, if I said, let's say I'm Turkish, and I am Turkish, and I try to do apologetics in Turkish, and I say, like, what's the Turkish for the word kelam? If I say Christ kelam, am I saying Christ is the kalam of kalam philosophy in Islam? Obviously not. It's the same term, but the concept behind the term is obviously different. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. And so what Origen is doing again is he's substituting Christian truths with Neoplatonic falsehood, and is promoting Neoplatonic falsehood and saying it's Christian truth, which it isn't. It isn't Christian. And so that's the difference between what the church fathers do and what Origen does. It's not just because they use, I mean, first of all, like they speak the Greek language and they use these concepts, but these words, but they don't mean the same concept, obviously. So there's a huge difference there. If you don't have anything to add, should we go
let's
to
just-
the
Well,
questions?
I'll
or-
mention too. I think a lot of people don't realize when they discuss this subject that, I mean, Maximus wrote 2 whole books about disputing the problems and refuting the problems in Origenism. So the Ambigua, not all of them, but many of them are dealing with Origenist problems, and one of those problems is, of course, the eschaton in terms of beings in stasis or in motion. And so, as many of you probably know, Maximus teaches that we are in ever-moving rest. Well, how could we be in ever-moving rest? That doesn't sound very amenable to Hellenic dialectics. Well, that's because we don't believe in Hellenic dialectics. And in the eschaton, the saints will transcend certain dialectical properties of the created order, right? And I'm using dialectic in 2 different senses here, right? So there is at times a differentiation, distinction. When we fell, we did enter into a dialectical problem state, you could say. But in the eschaton, that will be resolved, and we won't be in a situation where we're subject to the problems of dialectical opposition. And so Maximus says that the saints will have an ever-moving rest. In other words, we're not subject to dialectics. God is undividedly divided. God is 1 and 3. God is immanent and transcendent. You see how all of these ideas are contrary to Hellenic dialectics. And that's because God transcends them. And when we participate in uncreated grace, we transcend a lot of these problems in dialectics. It doesn't mean that we cease being creatures, but it means that in the eschaton, we're not subject to these Hellenic problems. And by the way, there's a whole discussion of this in Stan Eloy. Stan Eloy has a whole chapter on how St. Maximus avoids the Origenist dialectics.
Hey, speaking of dialectics, stop me, guys, if you've heard this one. David Bentley Hart makes the argument that eternal, what does he do? He applies this kind of sophistry that eternal is not quantitative and a temporal forever, but rather qualitative. And kind of anachronistically reads that kind of in. But I was just thinking when you're talking about that, that's another example of dialectics that, well, why? So it has to be an either or. So if qualitative,
He's got
right,
1 or
there's a
3.
type of eternality is qualitative. Like, why does that exclude a quantitative forever? And that's just weird. I mean, do we only get a particular amount of time in the eschaton? It's like, well, it was maximally good. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. It's just such a strange thing when you start to kind of unpack this. You guys' thoughts on that?
Well, one thing that's really great about Stan Eloy's Volume 1 is that he has a really long section about the notion of time. And so we have a created non-temporal reality, right? So the aeon is an important doctrine where you kind of have the location of created forms, created angelic essences in the angelic beings in the aeon. And that's why we don't equate everything that's non-temporal with God or the essence of God or divine energies. So there is a created aeon, a non-temporal aeon that does come into being that is not, strictly speaking, temporal. And it's the realm of the angels, right? Losky has a really great section on this. And this is important because this is one reason why we can apply some of the ideas of created forms or essences or higher levels of reality without collapsing those into God. That would be Platonic, that would be Platonism. And we avoid that because we still say that those things can be creatures, right? So this is, again, the doctrine of the aeon. I've never heard anybody but Orthodox theologians even talk about the doctrine of the aeon. This does not mean the Gnostic doctrine of aeons. This is totally different.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's just the non-temporal angelic realm, you could say. It occurred at some point in Genesis 1. And that's an important distinction to make so that we don't collapse higher geometric forms or those kinds of realities into God, because they're still created.
Amen.
By the way, his section on the Aeon is page 156, 157, 158, 159. And this also allows us to have time as a created reality that's not evil. Time is a good thing, but it's a kind of preparatory phase for stepping into eternity. So time is like a thing that's going to help train us, you could say, for the eschatological reality. And that avoids the dialectic that the Greeks had between eternality, good, time, bad. So there's a, as you can see, the Greeks have another dialectic between being and stasis, motion and change, eternality, time bad, eternality good.
I think that Saint John of Damascus also de facto refutes Origen on his part on the eons.
Right, and I'm again the aeon that Maximus is talking about is not the aeon that you get in Origen's Hinad and all this kind of Gnostic stuff. By the way, there's a great paper I would recommend for what about Orthodox theologians like Ananias who are really influenced by Origen. What about the weird extreme personalism of Ananias? Well, there's a great paper refuting Ananias and pointing out the Origenism in Ananias by Ludovicos. And Ludovicos is a well-known Greek theologian. I highly recommend this paper if you want to, not just David Bentley Hart, but other Orthodox famous modernist theologians like Ananias that many people are aware of. They've also been influenced by Origen in the sense of rather than collapsing nature into person, they make person this thing that is in dialectical tension with nature. Yes, I know that seems strange, but that's the move that he makes. And Ludovicos has a great critique of pointing out how Ananias is basically just falling into another version of Origenism, and he even admits this. So all these modern theologians just have this obsession with trying to revive and make Origen palatable. Why we don't need any of this nonsense. It's stupid. Hellenism is foolishness, right? That doesn't mean that we can't take, as you pointed out, Father Deacon, a good argument out of a philosopher. We know St. Maximus uses Porphyry. We know St. Maximus read Plotinus. We know Dionysius has similarities to Plotinus. Nobody denies that. But that doesn't mean we're going to take the presuppositions about what simplicity is, what dialectics mean, what free will is, and import that into our theology. That's what every heretic does. Every heretic says that the theology has to conform to what my stupid word concept fallacy is.
By the way, that's my next video. I just got it. Top 5 ways not to be a heretic. Don't do this.
Number 1, have a brain. Number 2, believe in God.
Believe in God. Maybe
not in
10.
yourself. Maybe it can be top 50.
That'll be too long of a video.
Number 50, don't be Origen.
Are we
Don't
about
be an
done?
Origen
Do we want to do the
Yeah. Let's do.
Okay.
Let's do Q&A if we can, or the super chats or whatever.
That's what I was gonna say. Q&A.
Yeah.
All right. So Tom Green for $5. Dire Wave, baby. Have a good stream. Thank you, Tom Green. We did. In Christ, new wineskins, $40. Father bless to Deacon Ananias, many years to Snek, David J, and the Orthobros. Keep exposing these heresies, which the one true church combats to this day. You are warriors for Christ. We appreciate the work that you do for the Orthodox around the world. Thank you.
God
Much
bless you.
appreciated.
God
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shining Diamond, $3. Why do modern critics say Chrysostom and Gregory of Nyssa were Origenist? Well, I've never heard that about Chrysostom because he's pretty forceful about his doctrine of the eternality of hell. Chrysostom was very much a hellfire brimstone preacher, if you've read a lot of his homilies. So I've never heard that about Chrysostom, but as we already covered, yes, St. Gregory of Nyssa, as the other Cappadocians, they were influenced by Origen, but doesn't mean that they accepted all their all of Origen's presuppositions and arguments. And again, in the Ambigua, St. Maximus actually has to deal with multiple places where Nyssa is talking about ideas in Origen. So again, this should be a common rule amongst everybody. By the way, no church, I don't care if you're Protestant, Roman Catholic, or Orthodox, there's really nobody who actually follows any single church father in everything. So this is true for everybody. So, I mean, if you're a Roman Catholic, you don't follow Augustine in everything. You don't follow Jerome in everything, right? Literally. So this shouldn't even really be a debate or a problem that if one of the saints has something wrong or they got some idea wrong. Nicholas David, $10. Thank you, Nicholas David. Much appreciated. Flooded Basement, $5.
Oh, I love that guy. Yeah, I know him from Twitter.
Okay. This is fitting that most modern Origenists are spiritual eunuchs. Yeah, I think that is a good analogy because remember that really the force of Origenism in terms of like the big money and the liberals and the modernists that want to utilize and promote Origenism is because of his perennialist potential. And perennialism has the ability to, or perceived ability to unite all the religions and remove factionalism, right? So, if we just realize that, Christianity is one of the many cloaks that the higher true religion wears, can't we just all get along and can't we just kind of do a higher academic, philosophical, mystical understanding of the skeletal outlines of all the true religions, right? Or all the religions. Go ahead.
Do dogma even matter? Everybody's going to heaven. We don't care.
Yeah, exactly. Who cares about dogma if we're all saved? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and this is something I talked with Luke Hendred of Orthodoxy first when we made the podcast. I made the point to him that your theology can affect your politics. I mean, I've never seen someone who's an Origenist have good political views. I've never seen
they're
someone...
always shit-libs, dude.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah, they're always far leftists. They're always... they're like 1 degree of separation between being an abortionist, even. And they probably, most of them are abortionists, probably, let's be honest.
The aborted baby will be saved. Anyway.
Well, everybody's saved.
Yeah.
Right, so who cares? All right, that's all of the super chats that I see. I'll have the links to you guys' Twitter and channels below. Anybody have any parting comments that they want to leave us with?
Subscribe to me. Hello, guys. Subscribe to my channel. That's all I'm gonna say. If you want other stuff, I plan on making a video on the theology of icons, which is why I mentioned it on Origen because of its connection. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, check out my channel in a couple of days, maybe a week. I don't know. That's all I gotta say. And follow my channel, of course.
Anybody else?
And also follow Father Deacon Ananias, obviously Jay. And Snek doesn't have a YouTube, but you can follow him on Twitter.
Yeah, actually, there's a video from the Orthodox Defense on icons as well that was uploaded today. Good introduction on theology of icons.
Good. And a blessed nativity to all of you. Don't forget, with the beauty of nativity comes the nativity demons. So be on guard. Let us all pray for each other. And pray that your friends